Okay, I want to introduce the moderator, Raymond, and he's going to lead this lovely group up here in discussion on the topic you haven't heard too much about, generative AI. I'm kidding, of course. So Raymond, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hope you're looking forward to this discussion. By the way, kudos to the other panels. I think they did an incredible job and set, quite frankly, a very high bar. Yeah. And then, before we get into it, I've got to say that I really like the fact that we have such a really robust, not just cybersecurity, but IT community here in North Dallas or North Texas. It's great to get together with everyone, collaborate, learn, grow. Thanks to the sponsors, to the vendors who really, invest in us and make sure that we've got these opportunities to come to these great locations and have these conversations. So with that, just getting into this. So tongue-in-cheek, not a topic we've heard a lot about recently, right? So I think probably since the beginning of the year, Gen AI has been almost the #1 topic on not just on the minds of IT, but also in terms of our business leaders, organizations trying to figure out where do we go, what do we do, how do we leverage it. It's the new shiny toy, but it's also sort of really lots of opportunities ahead of us. So hopefully today we can dig in just a little bit and provide some context, some experiences, really talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that we all face. So before we get started, let's do some introductions, and I'll leave myself for last. Sure.
Sure. Hi, I'm Charity Wright. I'm a threat intelligence consultant at Recorded Future. I've spent the past several years analyzing Chinese state-sponsored threats, AI, disinformation, but my career started U.S. Army and NSA, so I have a passion for intelligence, even artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nikhil, Gupta, founder and CEO of ArmorCode. We are building AI-powered unifying application security and infrastructure vulnerability management. We are talking about security and how things are kind of converging. So 20 years ago, people probably didn't care about much on the application. Everybody was focused on the infrastructure. But fast forward now, if any of the issues like Log4j or anything happens, the board and the CEO and the CISO comes in and ask you like, okay, is my application secure? So the strict thing, and we have several Fortune 500 global development customers, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Hi, I'm Jeff DeFord. I'm Vice President of Chief Technology Officer for Parkland Health, also known formally as Parkland Hospital. We're a live target for attacks and technology, so fortunately I'm not always a healthcare guy. I'm in financial consulting, Global 500, and other things before healthcare. So I've been there about 6 years, and it's been an experience. I've learned a lot. It's very humbling, so I feel very rewarding in what we do at Parkland.
And I'm Mike Britton. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer and Head of Privacy for At-Home Security. Been there for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was the CISO and Chief Privacy Officer for Alliance Data, a financial services company here in town. Just over 16 years. So it's fun going from financial services to a SaaS startup that's in the security space. It's fun things like this event.
And so I guess in terms of my experience, I actually grew up in pharma. So my first job was in clinical research. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry supporting many of the functions, so heavily regulated. And of course, today I work for arguably the largest sports franchise in the world. Very dynamic, very leading edge in terms of what they deliver from a fan experience perspective. And I'm always surprised by how many fans of that club, no matter where I go in this country. Fun fact, I moved from the East Coast about 19 years ago. I was still consulting for the firm I worked back east. I'd fly there on a Sunday night after a game, and half the planes wearing Cowboys jerseys. I'm like, what in the heck's going on? But it just kind of speaks to the broad reach of Cowboys nation, if you will, right? There's so many fans, not just within the US, but globally, right? So that's super exciting working for an organization like that. Not to say that pharma wasn't exciting. So, no comparison, right? No comparison, but I mean, the mission really was great. I had the opportunity to do a lot of really great things, moving from being a software developer and then pivoting 12 years ago into governance, compliance, and security. But we're here to talk about AI today, Gen AI specifically. And so the abstract for today's talk really focused on offensive and defensive strategies around Gen AI. But before we get into that, maybe we can touch very, very briefly, each of us, in terms of what are we doing internally. And I'll start. So within our organization, we're exploring opportunities. And this might be one of the very few instances where I've seen executive leadership driving the conversation, right? Maybe even getting to us before we were ready, quite frankly, but really looking for the opportunities of how can we use this new shiny toy to increase fan experience, increase engagement, etc. So maybe just briefly, we can just chat about what's happening in your world. What have you done? Where are you in the journey? Yeah.
Recorded Future is a threat intelligence company, so we are kind of diving headfirst into generative AI. We have come up with our own way of creating intelligence summaries from queries that our platform produces. So what that looks like is we're saving analysts a lot of time when they're searching in our platform for specific intelligence requirements and it comes up with results. We have a summary at the top that summarizes the findings below, and it has notations so that you can easily pivot to those sources where the sentence was summarized from. So right now we're focusing on not only saving analysts time on the job, but as a threat intel company, a big focus of ours is also tracking how threat actors are utilizing or preparing to utilize AI in malign ways. So part of that includes monitoring the dark web for mentions of ChatGPT and generative LLMs. What we've discovered is that threat actors are very excited about this technology. They are ready to dive in headfirst. They're using various algorithms and models to write their own malware, to automate fraud operations, and many other different use cases. So it's kind of exciting being at the front edge of that and like witnessing what's happening in the criminal underground, but it's also pretty terrifying. The way that we are trying to enable our clients is letting them know right up front how these threat actors are planning on using this technology and how you, as a corporate CTI team or threat intel team, can protect your infrastructure against those tactics.
Thanks. So ArmorCode, we are into application security and infrastructure vulnerability management, and like you mentioned that we are at the forefront of it. And the way I look at it, AI or generative AI, any new technology, is that it's like a nuclear power, right? So you can make a nuclear bomb out of it, which a lot of bad actors are doing, or you can create a nuclear energy and you can make a good use out of it. And of course, unfortunately, bad guys are always ahead of you. And so this is where, at ArmorCode, what we're doing is we are leveraging AI and generative to find out how we can increase the developer productivity. So ArmorCode's vision is to democratize software security, no matter what field you are. As I mentioned, we have the number one entertainment company, number one hotel company, number one hedge funds as our customer. And this technology, and as Elon Musk will say, that they are a software company, and so does the CVS, like the pharma company. That everybody's claiming, and to a certain extent, it's true that they're a software company. And how do you increase the speed of how you're developing the software? And so we are helping and enabling those companies to build the software faster and quicker. And one of the key ingredients, and if you look at it, and in any of the listening panel and a lot of people are here on the security, security is outnumbered by the developer. And the numbers ratio that we are seeing is for every application security engineer is 100, 200, or maybe 300 developers. So if you look at from the budget perspective, right? So of course, the engineering budget is like 3 times or 4 times of the security budget. And if you can enable, and in the security, it's a true partnership. Historically, security used to be a department of no. And I started my career 25 years ago at Bell Labs, where we were having release once a year. And at that time, moving from once a year to maybe once an hour, and you still have to develop that kind of critical software, the challenge is on the security team. And so that's where we are leveraging AI and generative AI to help developer productivity, at the same time making life of the security professionals easy.
Healthcare is tough, right? We were very mission driven. our first order of business is always to take care of the patients in our population entrusted to our care. Parkland Hospital, Parkland Health has been using predictive AI since about 12 years ago for looking at patient outcomes and looking at opportunities to have better patient outcomes as far as preventing sepsis. I'll leave these things back. Here we go. Preventing infections, looking at fall rates, looking at no-fail rates, and these are very basic predictive analytic type models. Where we're headed right now is taking these predictive analytic models and refining them and introducing generative AI into those models to get better outcomes. So we're transforming some infection models at the moment right now to look at how we use a very narrow-based LLM in this case rather than using broad-based LLM, because what we use is very proprietary and we don't want to have that information out. When you're talking about patient information, PHI, we need to be very focused on how we leverage these tools. And a bit conservative. It's not like us to go out and say, hey, you know what, OpenAI and ChatGPT, this wonderful, let's rock with it. We're not going to do that, right? We don't want to be in the news. We don't want to be on the Department of Health and Human Services wall of shame. I think if you've been out there, you know what I'm talking about. It lists all the incursions and data leakages. So we're conservative, but we're also looking at the way to use it in a more insightful and more precise way to have better outcomes. That being said, you know, down the road, we're looking at obviously the opportunities to reduce the administrative overhead. Right now, a typical provider, will spend about 51% of their time in the healthcare record system, and that's time that they're not dealing with patients, they're doing caseload. So when we look at the future of LLMs and generative AI, it's that administrative function that we're looking at getting a great benefit from. But again, we're not going to jump into that headlong because we're looking at ambient experiences to take the encounter with the patient and translate that into an encounter that goes into a healthcare record. It has to be spot on. There can't be any ambiguity about what's in the record. Same thing when we're drafting responses or after visit summaries for our patients. But tremendous opportunity, but also tremendous concern about hallucinations and all the things that come along that we read about with OpenAI and generative LLMs. But I think the future is exceedingly bright, and we're very excited about the opportunities that are coming online.
Yeah, so at Abnormal, one of the neat things about Abnormal is we're really an AI native company. Our founders came from AI, they came from ad tech, and so really from day one of our company and our product, it's all been AI and machine learning driven. And so now we're also looking at how do we leverage generative AI, both in our product and just internal processes as well. So, one of the things that we do now is, it's not part of our product, but we do have the ability to go in post-detection and say, okay, this phishing email was likely generated by Gen AI, and really start to show that not so much that it means much to the company or to the organization, but really just being able to show that yes, attackers are using Gen AI. I always like to say, whatever we use it for good, there's an attacker thinking about how they can use that same thing for bad. And so you're already seeing it in marketing and business development, and it's an easy way to write emails and intros to get meetings, things like that. The attackers are looking to do the same thing, and we're making sure that we can easily detect that. We can show, hey, here's where they're writing it, here's how they're generating it, just to kind of continue to keep up with the attackers.
And so maybe we just pivot for a second and think about challenges and opportunities. And I'm thinking back to the first session, right? So a lot of discussion about automation and RPA, et cetera, and how do you demonstrate value? How do you demonstrate ROI? In terms of what we're doing today, because this truly is, as I said earlier, nascent. For most of us, we're really just scratching the surface, trying to figure out what direction do we go in, what's available to us in terms of tool sets, guidance, et cetera. You've got organizations like Google, Apple, and others who have done an awful lot of work. Gartner has some information on their site. If you're a member, you can actually go look at that, kind of review and see what are the things you should be considering. But in terms of challenges and opportunities, and the key thing I think I heard earlier was that being aligned with the needs of the business is probably one of the most critical things to success. We can always go skunkworks, right? And I'm sure most of us do, right? We're developing something under the covers that no one really knows about, but to be truly successful in our organizations, especially in healthcare, you really have to be aligned with the strategic objectives of the organization. So how are we managing that challenge? How are we ensuring that we understand what are great candidates, if you will, versus maybe where something is truly embedded in your tool sets? So maybe it's different responses or different perspectives from the folks in the room. And let's start at the other end. Mike, you want to start?
Okay, Mike, you want to start? He picked on healthcare, so I'll jump right in. You do have to pay attention. I think you've seen what happened with COVID. Right? We used a lot of predictive AI to help drive COVID response within Dallas County. Tremendous opportunity. I think what we're seeing now is that healthcare is crushed. Right? It's broken. And we have to drive efficiency. So when you look at some of the things we're measuring, is it the pajama time? And believe it or not, that's actually a metric that is reported on how much time the providers are spending in the healthcare record system after hours when they should be spending time, or treating patients with encounters. So looking at how we drive those efficiencies so we can see more patients that have better throughput and not be the number one single site, busiest emergency department in the United States, which Parkland is. Nothing to brag about, but that's where we are. Driving those efficiencies is tantamount to keeping our community safe. To that though, when we start talking about decision support, so let's say Mike over here needs some help, he's come to see us and we're going to evaluate his case and we're going to leverage a Gen AI. There's a lot of risk that comes with that. We use a lot of ML and RBI, we're talking about machine learning to do decision support now, but now we're entering a whole other level. So what's the companionship look like? What's the certification look like? And what are the risks look like when you start introducing healthcare or other critical decision criteria through a construct such as a medical device or a software device that's now part of the continuity of care? So there's a lot of questions. I have more questions than answers, but it's a lot to consider.
Well, I think part of that's understanding what generative AI is good for and what it's not good for. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix all your problems. It does provide a lot of value. I think there's, especially from an information gathering perspective, or be able to correlate information quickly. There's a lot of really good uses for it, but it doesn't solve every problem. I think the other piece to keep in mind is there always needs to be that human kind of review. Go ask the lawyer that used ChatGPT to submit a brief and cited fake cases, and now he's in trouble with the judge. So, that's where a set of human eyes reviewing it and looking it over and giving it the once over is really good. And I think that's part of, if you go look at GDPR and some of these other privacy regulations out there, it's how can I do processing on scale, but also protect the rights and privacy of individuals. And a big key to that is that human review piece and really being able to say, okay, yes, Gen AI plays a role up to a point, but there still is that sanity check. There still is that kind of release valve to make sure that we're not doing something that's going to harm people.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up, because why we're having this discussion, it's a big deal if our partnerships or the technologies that we're looking into or already have make that move and what that means internally to us. So if we want to address that, you sponsors, but I would appreciate it if you would.
Well, I think that's where, when you start to get into like data ethics and transparency in your models, how you're making decisions, I think there's a lot of things you can be transparent with. You can explain, this is how we're doing it. Doesn't mean you have to give away secret sauce or proprietary information, but giving your customers or giving those involved that you're going to process their personal data, giving them that assurance that, yes, this isn't some black box that we're not going to, that's one of the big issues with, you look at OpenAI and ChatGPT and Bard and some of these others, there's a certain lack of transparency on the data sources. So I think people can kind of figure out where they're getting a lot of what they're crawling and adding to their large language models, but there's also very much under the guise of proprietary information, they're also not telling you where they're getting their information, and like anything else, I think we're starting to see, and we're going to see where attackers are also poisoning models. And so if I don't know where you're getting your data, and I don't know how you're protecting your models, then, me as an attacker, I'm just going to go after the models. I'm just going to poison your models. I'm going to put fake information in there, seed doubt, do things like that, because now people aren't going to trust your solution.
So just to add, like, when ChatGPT came in and we were talking about predictive AI and all this complex stuff, I just did a simple query. Who is the founder of ArmorCode? Right? And if you do a Google search, you can find it in seconds. That's Nikhil Gupta, but it gave some random name. And so you can imagine, like, while you're talking about ChatGPT and solving world hunger problem, but they couldn't solve a very simple answer. And this is to Mike's point, it depends upon the data source. Like if I go into it in Bard, who's kind of just scrolling all the Google stuff and all, then yes, of course, it will tell you. So I think so that's where, to Mike's point here, you have to be careful on, you cannot trust everything blindly. And this is the good and the bad side of it is that is the bad guys can exactly do the same thing is they can fudge the information. And we are in the business of securing software. And back in the day, what developers used to do was they would go into Google search, and there are sites where they go and get the software and then they will put it in. And instead of fixing an issue, you are actually probably injecting more vulnerabilities into it. Now, fast forward, now what does developers do? They go to ChatGPT and try to get that information. And if you're not keeping a governance on top of that, then again, you're going to have more problems than solving those problems. And this is where we have to look at it. And at the end of the day, these are underlying technologies, right? So that's not mean to the end. For example, if you're in healthcare, what you care about is better healthcare for the customers, for your patients at the end of the day. Now, whether you're using generative AI or not, doesn't matter. You're looking at your end KPI, it's like, okay, they're wasting 51% of their time in that. So depending upon the industry, same thing is from the software developer perspective in our case, or like in case of your work, you have to take care like what's the end goal and working backwards from that.
One of the biggest challenges we've faced is that element of the AI doesn't know what it doesn't know. So let's say Recorded Future, for example, we have one of the biggest repositories of intelligence in the world, and we allow our own GPT model, not ChatGPT, but our own private GPT model, to query that intelligence repository. Now, the trick is, we have great sources of intelligence, but we also collect on sources of disinformation. So what happens when the LLM queries against those sources of disinformation? It doesn't know that those sources are spitting out false information. It just knows that it's information. So that's where we had to come in with the human analyst aspect during our testing phase and go, hey, something is really wrong here. When we query about Wagner Group or a Russian APT, we're getting this wonderful information about how great they are and how they're heroes in Africa. Looked at the source citation, turns out it was pulling from a source of disinformation, so we had to kind of separate out those sources. I like to say that the AI is ignorant until it proves itself intelligent, because we are responsible for training it to query those valid sources. Yes, sir?
I have a specific question that is, I see a world where you can put in your environment, maybe, an Armis import, right? And then utilizing AI and threat modeling through something like a Recorded Future, extrapolate almost like a Monte Carlo simulation that says you have an 85% probability that you're going to be attacked on this vector, but if you put this control in, that now reduces, you can actually quantify reduction of risk based on modeling, and then you layer that onto maybe a quantum system which loves numbers. You could almost do what the Googles and the you predict in such a way that you know more about the attack than the attacker. Is that something that either Recorded Future, or am I just throwing out there something that can be achieved?
Build it, Eric. That's great. Good job. Build it.
$10 later. Woo!
I like the way you think. We actually this year created a threat actor threat map that maps out from your watch list. Let's say you've uploaded your IPs, your domains, your tech stack watch list, and from there we populate a graph that shows the capability and intent of certain threat actors to target you. So then on that graph, you can see the ones that are very high up or very far to the right are the most likely to target you, and you're most vulnerable to them. So we are using some types of AI for those purposes, but I like the way you're going quantum. I think that's definitely a future consideration. Anybody else?
Just one quick thing, it's the buzzword, right? We're somewhere in the hype cycle. I don't think we've reached the pinnacle with OpenAI and Gen AI. Let's talk about what it is and isn't, right? It's just math vectoring. It's what's the next word. So, Mike, you said something really key a moment ago. This rate of correlation, answer for even within a certain extent, right? Because it's looking at the numbers, and this is a math equation and the number of predictors you have in the model. But what it's not good at is causal. It won't help you look at cause and effect, and that requires intervention and oversight. So knowing how to use these tools and knowing what they're capable of will be part of your, that's a watershed moment. Being successful either offensively or defensively.
Unless, yeah, I was just going to say, any more questions?
So I do want to unpack what you all said. So as a CIO, you're really in a very tough spot. You're completely sold on the opportunities that exist with AI and everything that can be done, right? But at the same time, it's not a reliable service solution because of the governance is not enforced, litigations and regulations not enforced, and you are in the midst of, I want to give this to my user base, to my employees. But whatever I use, there's nobody to back it up in terms of reliability. What do you think has to change? What do you think has to happen? And how do you want to advise us CIOs in terms of how do we take it from here?
So I think what Jeff said is actually just about the situation that we've got, right? So you truly cannot trust those models. So you mentioned, let's say governance, right? What structures do we need to have in place to ensure that whatever solutions we're actually exploring, how do you validate them? Now, some industries might have data sets, healthcare, engineering, there are lots of them where you've got clearly defined data sets that have sort of a defined model, you know exactly what that information is. That might better support using something like Gen AI to get better fidelity in your results. But if you're using open sources, and most of these models have been trained on scraping the internet, right? And to Charity's point, you can have sort of those anomalies because once you factor in that there's disinformation out there as well, can it actually figure that out, right? Is it good at doing sentiment analysis? No, it's not. So I think from a governance perspective, and not just yourself as the CIO, I would imagine that your general counsel is involved as well, right? Because anything that goes to risk, lawsuits, et cetera, regulatory issues, you really have to have those structures in place to evaluate what is the opportunity you're pursuing, what are the possible negative impacts of using Gen AI, and be able to evaluate that. I'm not sure exactly how you do that, but it should be front of mind in what we're doing today, right? So does that answer the question?
Yes, wanted to know, is there anything that we can do to unpack that? How do we get to that? Because there's nothing that exists.
Yeah, and I guess what other governance structures do you have in place? Within security, for example, there are a lot of things that we attempt to do, but you always have to sort of calculate whether or not the tool that you're using has the ability to really find those things. And I'll turn to Charity. When you're looking at threat intelligence that's out there, what's the fidelity of it? How many data points you were talking about? Can you truly trust it? If you're building AI on top of that, I'm sure that you have to sort of explore that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's definitely an ethical factor. I think those of us that work for companies that are ethical, claim to be ethical, are accountable to being ethical, we're very lucky. Not all of them are. So many companies are just trying to get one step ahead of the competition and just make money. So I think the answer is regulation, but that could go off on a totally different tangent. But I know you also had something to say.
Yeah, so I think so. This is a very pivotal moment, right? Like, and I compare this to when electricity was kind of discovered, or when steam engine came in and things like that, because it will disrupt the way everything is done. And as Jeff was saying earlier, in healthcare, they have to move a little slow. And so again, going back to the basics on the business level, you have to ask yourself, like, okay, what could be the most negative impact? And just like any technology adoption, there will be a binomial distribution curve. So typically what we have seen in security world is that the financial worlds are like the ones that are leading on this, right? Because at the end of the day, they will do the maths and they will say, okay, if we get these new features out and it can help me do this transaction much faster, I'm talking about $50 million loss versus what is the risk versus reward versus like in the healthcare, that's not the equation. So what will happen is we all have to look at from a business perspective, what's the gain versus this, and of course you have to make sure that ethics and all those things are like paramount. That is basic. All of us should think about it, and based on that, your risk appetite will change. In fact, even in financial, like I've been talking to say Fortune 50, Fortune 100 financial institutes. One is extreme left, where they are like, okay, we are going all in. They're getting the private LLMs. They're in partnership with Microsoft and all in. The other ones have gone the other extreme, where they have blocked as simple as ChatGPT AI, OpenAI. You cannot do that. So, so it can.
Pearson has a question.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I have a question specific to the healthcare industry. I know privacy is often overlooked. If you're collecting the individual's information, VHI, right, and artificial AI is based on neural networks, machine learning, how does it affect the privacy of the individual information? You see that? Like, are we thinking about using it responsibly?
Sure, privacy is not last on the list, in healthcare it's first on the list. We are a part-rich environment because I'm gonna say, we're the Walmart, right? You can go to Walmart and get everything you need, you get tires and we'll change any groceries, right? Same thing with healthcare. If you're a bad guy, I've got your information, I've got your PII, I've got your PCI information, if you're next of kin, I have all that. So we look at this very, very methodically, very carefully, and we always scrutinize. So we don't take it lightly. But using the data, using Gen AI in an effective manner is the success to healthcare. We have to look at not the data being the people and the PII and the PHI, but rather what are the underlying constraints, or what's the symptomatic, what's their problem, what are we treating here? So it does become about the data. And there are ways that you can use Gen AI very effectively to go back and scrub information and then make it searchable and usable for research studies and things like this. So there's tremendous opportunity here because it can do it much faster. Now, back to what we said earlier, it's also about what it can and what it can't do. I'll use a really stupid analogy and I'll hand the mic over. I had to call a guy to work on an irrigation system. What did I look for? Was he bonded? Was he licensed? Insured, right? What are we doing with Gen AI? If I have something coming in that's making critical decisions, either financial or in software or in healthcare, what is the accreditation and certification process to give me assurance that it's not going to give me BS information, right? So back to what was said earlier, we do need to look at this, but the problem is that technology outpaces policy by light years. So we are nascent, we are at a tipping point, we are doing a lot of exploratory questioning in healthcare and other industries about what is the right tool for the job and is this the right tool for the job?
Well, and I think that's where Europe continues to kind of lead. So they have the AI Act that's now out there. And, it's back to that same kind of principle of what's the harm? What's the impact to the user? If I'm running Gen AI and, the output isn't going to cause me irreparable harm, well, that's one thing. But if the output, in a healthcare sense is, it's going to give me a diagnosis and a doctor's just going to run with it, well, that could potentially be very harmful, especially when you're talking about, life or death situations. And so I think that's where understanding how it's used, the transparency, using data sources ethically, just being above board and really having those checks and balances and having that human intervention at the right spots for the right processes. Maybe it doesn't need to be there for everything, but there are certain stop gaps where there should be a human review. There should be someone that looks at it and, just like you wouldn't go out to Google and the first site that popped up, just take it for gospel truth and run with it. And so we have that same mindset for the, don't trust anything on the internet. Well, where's all this data coming? It's coming from the internet. And so just because a machine can analyze, terabytes of data quickly and give you results doesn't mean that it's any more trustworthy than me Googling it and pulling up the first site.
Just faster.
Yeah, it's just faster.
So going back to your question about healthcare specifically, as Jeff said, we've had HIPAA for quite some time, right? So it's a 2013 that's sort of a formal. It's been around for a while, but what I would say is that most organizations that have sensitive data they already have structures in place to sort of measure the risk, ensure that we're not violating regulations or whatever it is. So I think you build on top of that, right? Certainly Gen AI has introduced additional complexity, if you will, or questions about hallucinations, et cetera. But I think those core structures are in place. From a pure security perspective, in a lot of cases, we're talking about the confidentiality aspect, right? So is the information that we hold considered to be non-public? It should not be shared, et cetera. Well, therefore, you shouldn't be putting that information into a large language model, which is available to everyone. Right. So I think those decisions that have to be made are, the structures are already in place, we're just adding another use case. But going forward, that's the question. For companies that maybe haven't had to deal with that before, now you're playing in a different space. Now you're talking about people's PI or potentially other types of data. So it's really just having, understanding what's the impact, whether it's privacy or whatever it is, and how do you actually manage that in your organization. I think as cybersecurity professionals, it's not just about blocking threats, it's also about the integrity, and someone mentioned earlier, availability of systems, right? So, but from a confidentiality perspective, we have to make sure that we're not putting people's data at risk, whether it's healthcare or otherwise, right? So getting those structures in place, I think, is part of what our organizations are already doing, and maybe you can talk about that. Actually, does anyone have, what challenges are you guys facing?
What I'm getting from the panel you're saying is, back to integrity, et cetera.
Core values, yeah.
Right, core values, and what you were bringing up. So the best thing we can do as an enterprise or as leadership within our enterprise is to police ourselves, because somebody will if we don't. So the more we can contribute to that standardization, if we just use that word, the better off we are, right, from an enterprise perspective. So
I guess one question I have is, has any of your organizations moved beyond simply putting an acceptable use policy for AI in place? And if so, what does that look like? Well, let's start with you. On the spot.
Can I cover the name tag? So our organization has both an ethical and legal framework. So your compliance and legal teams and such, they have a whole team of people. Oh, you're going to do anything AI? And this was before generative AI came out, right? If the term AI was anywhere in your project name, these people suddenly showed up. We said, who are you? What? I'm just pulling a vendor product. They have AI somewhere in the thing. And they do an incredible dive into how is it trained, how to do all this. Those are more on the predictive rather than the generative, right? But in the stakeholders that we had, we're talking about this. Well, you can't put this sensitive data, you can't put this client data into a generative model. That's exactly what they want to do. They want the model to make decisions about this really internal, proprietary, and client stuff. So our organization has first of all said, yeah, don't do that yet, right? And we have started to develop our own relationship with other vendors to say, look, we're going to host our own instance, if you will, so you can safely add things to a prompt, and it's only going to affect our space, right? And the people who have been thought leaders in our organizations and people they brought in to talk on the topic have spoken of, okay, great, now you've got the ability to use your own broad language model and feed your prompts into it. But what about, let's take it to the code generation, generative AI, right? What about building your own inner source? Right? People talk about inner source, your developers keep track of everything they've made, and now you use it in your organization, you reuse your stuff. Well, what if you train your own generative code model based on your developer's own experience? So it becomes this is the way we do things. So the same thing goes for other data sets as well. I'm very curious to ask you later about your own LLM related to your stuff. So we've seen everything from the legal side to the technology prototyping and the inner source side to, okay, you want to use it as is and you want to feed it prompts, we're going to give you a place where it won't go out to anybody else.
Well, and I would say, I think that's where on the security side, IT side, you've got to engage legal and you've got to engage your privacy folks. You have to have that constructive conversation. I think the worst thing, and I'll just say it, I think the worst thing that an organization can do is take the head in the sand approach of we're just going to block it and stop it.
Yeah.
I think what you're inviting is you're inviting your end users to go around that. It's too easy to get to, it's too easy to use. So, you know, the mindset of we're gonna put a policy in place and we're gonna block it, I think you're just setting yourself up for failure. But, you know, there's a lot of, because we've done this too, we've looked at GitHub's Copilot to figure out how to, you know, how do we write better code faster, more efficient. And, you know, we've waded through all the issues. We've looked at the issues from the intellectual property perspective. You know, if we produce something out of GitHub, I don't want to be sued later on because it pulled somebody else's code that was intellectual property. And just really having, you know, and part of it's having good partners in legal, having good partners in security, having good partners in privacy that understand the technology, are willing to kind of think through all the issues and best guide the organization forward without this approach of, no, we're not going to do that, end of story.
I want to piggyback on that. One of the best ways that you as a security team can identify AI threats and defend against them is to create an intelligence priority around AI. If this is a major concern for your board and your leadership, the best way to approach this is to go to your security team or your threat intelligence team and ask them, is generative AI or AI technology in general a concern of ours in this team? If you haven't added this to your intelligence priorities, let's do that. What they will do with that intelligence priority is they will do an assessment on what types of threats are we facing? What does that look like all the way down to the tactical level? And then with each step of that tactical level, how can we defend against that? That will drive your intelligence collection so that anytime a new APT or a new cyber criminal is using one of these technologies, you're gonna find out about it, you're gonna be aware, and you're gonna defend against it immediately. So highly recommend you add this topic to your intelligence priorities. Yes, sir, in the back.
How much of an operation do you see today or do you foresee fully generative AI being able to carry out? Like, here comes the denial of service attacks. Here comes the spear phishing. Here comes poisoning of your language model database, right? And things that you're using for coding that's actually going to give us backdoor back into the environment. I mean, are we so far out in the future? Is it happening today? I think that's kind of the concern is, how do you defend against something that basically just constantly coming out?
Yeah, so we've already written several proof of concepts just to show how easy it is where, you know, I can plug in a name to generative AI and it can produce a, you know, a BEC email to you that is super convincing. It knows, you know, where you've gone to school, it knows who you've interacted with, and, you know, I can easily send one that, hey, you know, this is Mike, I worked at Trellix, I saw that you were, you know, at FireEye, I'd love to pick your brain on something, please, let me know when you have a chance. And so that whole social engineering aspect of, I add credibility, that's all easy to do with generative AI today. And not only that, but I can also, you know, the AI and the capabilities are there that when you reply back, I'm not even having to respond. The Gen AI is responding back and continuing that conversation with you.
And so let's say things like shows, right? And so it's going in there and basically doing swipes at the end, figuring out where are your connected assets, where do you have vulnerabilities, what are the things that you don't see that I'm now aware of? What are the exploits that I need to use? Let me go pull, I've got this list of, credentials once I'm inside of the environment. I mean, are we to the point that we're never really going to need to worry about that type of scenarios and attacking pushing button and carrying out the full operation?
No, I think we see it today. Like right now, the automation is there where an attacker can attack your organization and send 10,000 unique emails to 10,000 people in your organization, all from unique email addresses, all with unique subject lines and content. And part of the problem is a lot of our legacy ways of stopping those type of attacks are looking for known bad. So the old day, if I knew a bad domain, I could block it and it's protecting my organization. Well, what happens when I'm dealing with 10,000 that we've never seen before, and there's nothing in them that says, hey, this is a coordinated attack of 10, a single attacker trying to attack me 10,000 times. This is 10,000 unique attacks all coming at once, and that's where.
And I just want to be clear, are you just referring to all all spear phishing, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, we see it on the email side, so obviously that's what we do, and so, you know, from an email perspective, yeah, we see it all the
What
time.
about on the recorded future side? We see them kind of doing scans of the internet, being able to use stuff like Shodan, be able to find vulnerable assets that maybe security doesn't have visibility into, that would be the initial. And I kind of go back and look at like M-trend reports, and you look at, hey, here's 1,000 breaches, 32% of the time, that initial vector, they're coming in, they're getting a material incident that occurs, happens from a vulnerability that somebody doesn't see, and it could be connected to the internet, it's an edge device. Is AI being leveraged in that way?
Our biggest challenge in knowing whether or not it's AI powered or generated is that it is the same actions as any other malware, let's say. Let's go the malware route and talk about the attack chain. The actions are the same and in the same order. The difference that we've observed is the speed and the resilience of those. Let's say if we take it down real fast, how quickly does it spin up again and go a different angle? One example that I wanted to share with you all is actually not malware related, but it's disinformation related. So I was analyzing Chinese disinformation over the past couple of years, and earlier this year, we found a campaign on Twitter, now referred to as X, and this campaign, it was like a DDoS attack of a malign narrative. The bots spun up, and as soon as the security team was able to get those bots taken down, hundreds more came back in full force. It lasted for a couple of days, and it was breathtaking. Like, it was incredible to see the volume of how many of these bot accounts could spin up, spit out a particular narrative, and then reshare or retweet what the others are saying in that particular network. It was hundreds and hundreds of bots spitting out malign narratives for a specific purpose that we don't have time to go into. But it was incredible to see how they used it on social media in the way that we see it happen in cyber attacks like DDoS attacks.
Yeah, I think so. It's going to happen in everything. So my in the email security, because that's the business he is in, and we are in the business of software security. Now, if you have to have 1,000 releases in a day, like it does not the number with the other organization do, and everybody aspire to do that. Now, the security team is the same. They are outnumbered, and if you have to get that kind of speed of software development to meet the business needs, there's a good chance that you are going to a site, there's a disinformation where you're getting a software which is injecting vulnerabilities over there. So I think so the problem is everywhere here, and the points the panelists were saying is very hard, and they're keeping the end behavior the same, but the magnitude has just magnified.
And do you think that like deceptive defenses are going to be important in the future, like creating fake accounts in AD? Just the only way that they're used as a trigger within the security team to identify those critics. I think somebody said it's ignorant until it decides that it's intelligent, right? So I and that, do you think that that's something that the company should be looking? And I have no stake in that game. I'm just wondering, trying to figure out, like all of us, how are we going to solve this? Move that forward, right? We're going to create big OT networks, right? Big healthcare networks that look like this is the target with the intent of finding AI and something that's pretty resilient and understanding that that's going on.
So I think so. The answer is it's not just one thing. You all have to look at, understand for your own business, and in that particular case, you will have to have some. And we used to do it earlier. We have servers which are fake servers, and then it's a honeycomb server. If somebody is going over there, then you know that there's an attack, right? Now we have to see it like based on these new attacks, how we can do it. So it's a defensive there. There are multiple ways you will have to look at it to how to secure it.
Thank you.
One more question, and then we're going to start wrapping up.
Yeah, so I'm hearing some good topics here, like tracing intellectual property from data sets or models. And then, knowledge is power and making decisions on that data. So my question I want to put up for the panel is, what are your comments on if that data set is biased? What if the model is also biased? How do you detect how do you mitigate, the question is, what are your thoughts?
I'll take a shot.
AI bias, yeah.
Yeah, bias is real. It's also prevalent just based on the type of question you ask and how you ask the question. What we're seeing in medical and early trials is that you can take a Gen AI model and it can take something very complex and break it down to a fourth grade consumer level. Very good at summarizing those thoughts. Now, the inverse is not true, right? So what we're seeing in this industry, in this vertical, is that we're using purpose-built machines, right? Purpose-built, curated data sets that are trained in a way that is ethical and also aligns with the outcomes that we're trying to get. So the broad base or the open source public, Gen AI models are really, you have to look at those the way we're talking about. Very, very wary, right? But if you own it and control it, your risk of bias is in your hands, right? Because you can take your data and you can figure out what you can put in there, and in this case, you can train where you want to train it. But it takes time and money. So
a lot of that source code and data sets are going to be reused in other projects of that group, so it's important to minimize it up front and before you put it into the...
It's an operational consideration. Even going back 12 years and looking at predictive analytics and how we're doing it, you have to go back and recalibrate, right? What's your measure? What's your barometer for success? Are you getting the outcomes? You can take two models that have very similar code and they have very different outputs based on the same data that's fed into them. So it does go back to companion, right? Is a companion another instance or another instantiation of a Gen AI model? Or is it human oversight or a combination therein? I really think it comes down to what problem you're solving and how you approach the particular problem or solution.
So I think it's a great question, and I think this is kind of the crux of what we have to struggle with, right? Because clearly we need to have controls in place. We need to have structure that's wrapped around the things that we're doing. It's in my mind, it's analogous to how you develop a clinical trial, right? You have to have a sort of, what are you trying to prove? And how do you actually identify whether you've met that marker or not? How do we identify when there are things out there that we don't know about? You're asking a question about, tell me that the thing that I don't know exists. It's almost like an existential question, right? So, but anyway, I really want to thank everyone on the panel for the great insights. I want to thank the sponsors, obviously, and Robin, she's running away. Leah, Robin, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for the questions.